You walk into the family gathering expecting warmth, but instead you feel the sting of silence. Every heirloom, every memory once tied to your mother, is handed to your sister without hesitation. You are present, yet invisible, treated as if your voice, your years of sacrifice, carry no weight. In that moment, it isn't just jewelry that is lost, but recognition, belonging, and dignity. What would you do if the family meant to protect you erased you from your own legacy? Stay with this story, because the answer will unfold in ways you would never expect. And if you value stories of resilience and truth, a gentle like and subscribe will mean the world, so we can keep sharing them together. You sit quietly in the corner of the room, your eyes following every gesture of your parents and relatives. What should have been a warm family gathering feels like a silent verdict being declared. On the old wooden table, every piece of jewelry, every cherished heirloom of your mother is laid out carefully. The necklace she wore on special occasions, the wedding ring preserved for decades, even the silk scarves that still carried her gentle scent, all of it was handed to your sister. No one asked for your thoughts, no one glanced your way. Everything happened as if your presence was nothing but excess. Inside you, an emptiness spread. Not because of the material value of those items, but because they carried the memories, the love, and the bond with the mother you adored. You remember evenings sitting by her side, listening to her stories, her steady voice teaching you how to stand tall against life's storms. Now, all those memories were erased with a single cold decision. Everything goes to Lydia. You look at your sister. Lydia glowed in the admiration of your parents, like a precious jewel they never stopped praising. You didn't hate her, but the pain of favoritism had carved itself into you like a quiet scar. It wasn't just today, it had been there since childhood. You recall every time she was praised for the smallest achievements, while your efforts were brushed aside as expected. You remember birthdays where all eyes were on Lydia, and you were only a shadow in the background. To outsiders, you might seem fortunate. A stable job, a respected lawyer. But not to your family. In their eyes, your success could never compare to the potential Lydia represented. Even your independence, buying your first home, was dismissed as just enough, close quote, never worthy of recognition. You recall your graduation day. The moment you held your honors diploma, you searched the crowd for your parents' proud smiles. Their seats were empty. They had chosen to attend a minor event for Lydia instead. That was the first time you understood clearly. Love in this family was never shared equally. As a child, you once believed if you worked harder, achieved more, they would finally see you. But growing older taught you the truth. It wasn't about what you did. It was about where their hearts had always been completely invested in Lydia, leaving you to carve out your place in a home that should have been yours too. The pain didn't explode into screams. It seeped in silently, like raindrops through a roof, dampening and chilling your heart. Yet deep inside, you held on to one truth. Your worth could not be erased by favoritism. You chose silence, but not surrender. You built your own life quietly, proving yourself day by day. But today's family meeting reopened every wound. You were once again pushed aside, once again denied. That necklace was not just jewelry, it was a symbol of continuity, of trust your mother left behind. And now, in Lydia's hands, you realized you had been erased from the family picture, as if you never truly belonged. In that moment, you asked yourself, do I still have a place here? Is it worth waiting for recognition that will never come? Or is it time to write my own story, one that needs no one's permission? You drew a deep breath, holding back tears that wanted to escape. You knew your silence wouldn't last forever. There would come a day when you would rise, showing the world and even this family that you were never just Lydia's shadow. You are yourself, and your value cannot be hidden. That's when your heart whispered, one day, justice will speak on its own. You stepped outside to the porch. The evening sky was still, sunlight fading over the familiar garden. Looking at the trees, memories of childhood flooded back, running, falling, your mother's arms lifting you up. You realized you no longer needed approval to survive. You had grown, strong enough to write your own path. If your family couldn't see you, the world beyond these walls would. And in that moment, you knew. Your future was not defined by favoritism, but by your own heart and resilience. If you've ever felt left out by those who should have cherished you, stay until the end of this story. And if you want to walk with us on these journeys of resilience, a simple like and subscribe will be more than enough to keep our stories alive together. You returned home after the family meeting, carrying a heaviness that seemed to fill every corner of your being. The walls of your apartment stood still, but inside your mind, the voices of favoritism echoed like a cruel refrain. You lowered yourself into the chair by your desk, pulling open a drawer and staring at the neat stacks of files, contracts, and framed certificates. Every document was a testimony to the path you had carved for yourself, proof of nights spent in study and days spent in courts defending strangers with all the strength you had. Yet despite all this, a bitter question gnawed at your heart. Why did none of it matter to your parents as much as Lydia's smallest achievement? Memories rose uninvited. A rainy night long ago returned to you as if it had happened only yesterday. You were a child then, sick with fever, too weak to rise from bed. You had waited for your mother, hoping she would sit beside you, soothe your burning forehead, whisper the comfort only a mother can give. But instead, she was away, escorting Lydia to her dance rehearsal. You were left alone in the dim light, your body trembling beneath a thin blanket, with only a damp cloth cooling your brow. At that age, you didn't have the words to describe favoritism. You only knew the ache of longing, the sharp sting of being forgotten. How many people, you wondered, have felt invisible in their own families? How many have sat quietly, yearning for recognition that never came? If you were in my place, would you keep silent, or would you demand to be seen? The years passed, and you grew strong enough to fight for others. In the courtroom, you raised your voice for strangers who had been silenced, who had been denied fairness. You could argue for justice with passion and conviction, and more often than not, you won. Yet when you returned to the home that had shaped you, you found yourself shrinking back into silence. How could you fight for the world and still feel so powerless with your own family? The contradiction gnawed at you. Family should have been your anchor, the place where you drew strength. Instead, it was the shadow that made you doubt your worth. Even in moments of triumph, signing your first big contract, buying your first home, earning respect in your career, you carried the weight of their indifference. They applauded Lydia's every step while treating yours as nothing more than the minimum expected. When the loneliness became unbearable, you reached for the wooden box tucked deep inside your closet. Inside were a handful of letters your mother had written to you years ago. Though she was gone, her words remained, fragile on fading paper. In one, she had written, "My daughter, the world may turn away from you, but remember, you have the power to build your own road." Tonight, those words echoed with a clarity you had never felt before. Perhaps your parents could not see you. Perhaps Lydia would always be the jewel in their eyes. But that truth did not erase your value. Every wound you carried had forged you into someone resilient, someone capable of rising, no matter how many times she was pushed down. You reminded yourself, your worth is not a gift granted by others, it is a truth you carry within. You thought of your clients, the woman who had fought for custody of her child after years of being dismissed. You remember the look on her face when the court finally recognized her rights. That light in her eyes, that relief, it reminded you that recognition could change your life. And you asked yourself, if I can help others win justice, why am I afraid to claim it for myself? The city lights outside your window flickered like distant stars. You stared at them, realizing you no longer needed your family's approval to survive. You had already proven you could stand on your own. Still, the emptiness lingered, the silent wish to be seen and valued by the people who should have loved you first. One day, you told yourself you would speak. Not to argue over necklaces or heirlooms, not to compete with Lydia for parental affection, but to make it clear that you existed, that your story, your struggles, your victories, mattered. You imagined the moment. Standing in front of them, no longer silent, your voice steady and calm. You would tell them who you had become, and they would have no choice but to listen. Maybe they would be shocked. Maybe Lydia would falter. Maybe the image they had carefully built around her would finally crack. But most of all, you would no longer carry the shame of being invisible. As you pictured that day, you realized something powerful. Justice might never come from them. Justice might begin with you. You rose from your chair and stepped to the window. The night air was cool, carrying the hum of the city below. You thought of the garden at the old family house, where you had once played as a child, where your laughter had filled the air until someone told you to be quiet so Lydia could rest. That garden had not forgotten you, and neither had your heart. You whispered to yourself, I will not wait any longer. My story will not remain silent. Taking a pen from your desk, you opened a fresh notebook. On the first page, you wrote, Today, I promise myself never to let favoritism erase me again. I will live my truth, walk my path, and no one, not even family, can deny my worth. Closing the notebook, you felt a calmness settle over you. Maybe your family would never celebrate you, but the world beyond those walls might. And more importantly, you would never again refuse to celebrate yourself. The question lingered still. Have you ever felt left out by the very people who were supposed to love you? It was not a question of anger, but of connection and invitation for others to see themselves in your story. If this story touches a memory in your own heart, share your thoughts below. Your words might be the comfort someone else needs. And if you want to keep walking with us through these journeys of resilience and truth, simply tapping like or hitting subscribe will be more than enough to let us continue telling them together. The days that followed felt strangely quiet, as though the world around you moved on without noticing the storm inside your chest. You went to work. You began to notice the small ways favoritism had shaped your life, not just in the obvious wounds of being excluded, but in the subtle patterns etched into your behavior. How many times had you chosen silence because you assumed no one would listen? How often had you dismissed your own achievements, believing they were never enough? The shadows of your childhood lingered in your decisions, whispering doubt even when the evidence of your strength was everywhere. One evening, you found yourself standing before the mirror. You studied your reflection carefully, searching for traces of the child you once were, the child who longed for approval, who tried endlessly to outshine her sister, who stayed up late memorizing textbooks just for the hope of hearing, "We're proud of you." That child was still there, but her eyes looked older now, tempered by years of quiet resilience. The mirror seemed to ask you a question you had avoided. If they never change, will you still keep waiting? The truth settled in slowly. Waiting had become a habit, but it was not a life. You had spent too many years hoping they would one day see you, hoping the imbalance would correct itself. But the weight of their indifference had stolen enough time already. You realized then that you no longer needed to prove yourself to them. The need to be seen was real, but the power to see yourself was stronger. The shift was subtle at first. You began to reclaim small moments that once passed unnoticed. When you won a difficult case, you allowed yourself a smile instead of brushing it off as expected. When you bought fresh flowers for your apartment, you let their fragrance remind you that beauty could exist even without an audience. When you met with friends, you shared your victories out loud, instead of hiding them in fear of sounding arrogant. Slowly, you began to untangle yourself from the invisible chains of comparison. Yet there were nights when old doubts returned, whispering that you were still behind, still the forgotten one. In those moments, you opened your notebook and read the promise you had written. "I will not let favoritism erase me again." The words anchored you, pulling you back to the truth you had chosen. Weeks passed, and then months. The distance between you and your family grew, not in miles, but in meaning. You still attended certain gatherings, still fulfilled basic obligations, but something inside you had shifted. You no longer went expecting recognition. You went simply as yourself, carrying your own worth quietly but firmly. At one such gathering, you watched Lydia retell stories of her small triumphs, stories that drew laughter and applause from relatives. Once, you would have shrunk into the background, measuring yourself against the brightness of her spotlight. But this time, you sat calmly, knowing your own light did not depend on anyone else's approval. You realized with startling clarity. The power of their favoritism had only ever been as strong as your belief in it. It struck you then how much energy you had spent chasing something they were never willing to give. And in that realization came freedom. You did not have to fight for their recognition any longer. You could live, and in living, prove to yourself that your worth had always been intact. Your mind drifted back to your mother's letters. Perhaps she had seen more than you thought. Perhaps, in her quiet way, she had left you the wisdom you would need when the time came. You remembered her line. "The world may turn away, but you can build your own road." And so you did. You threw yourself into your work with renewed purpose, but this time, it wasn't about proving anything. It was about honoring your own path. You took on cases that resonated with your heart, ones that reminded you of your own struggle. You stood beside people who had been dismissed, people told they were unworthy, and you fought for them with everything you had. Every victory was not just theirs, it was also a quiet victory for the child within you, who had once been told she didn't matter. You discovered a new rhythm to your days. Mornings began not with heaviness, but with intention. Evenings ended not with aching silence, but with gratitude for the life you were shaping. Slowly, the storm inside you calmed, replaced by something steadier, an acceptance that you could not rewrite your family's story, but you could write your own. Yet deep down, you knew this was not the end of the journey. The necklace, the heirlooms, the meeting, they were not just memories. They were symbols of a pattern that had defined years of your life. And while you had begun to free yourself, there was still a confrontation waiting, a moment when silence would no longer serve you. You could feel it approaching like the distant rumble of thunder. Not today, not tomorrow, but one day soon. You would have to stand in front of them, not to demand what was taken, but to speak your truth. And when that day came, you knew you would no longer tremble. For the first time, the thought did not fill you with fear. It filled you with calm. You had lived too long in the shadows, and now, you had learned how to carry your own light. Time has a way of revealing truths you once tried to hide from yourself. As days turned into months, the quiet transformation within you deepened. You no longer lived with the desperate need for recognition, yet the echoes of favoritism still lingered, like the faint outline of an old scar. You carried on with your life, working, laughing with friends, filling your apartment with reminders of who you had become. And still, in quiet moments, the thought of your family's indifference returned, whispering that the story wasn't finished. The necklace, the heirlooms, the family meeting, they remained symbols of everything unspoken. You had begun to heal, but the silence between you and them had grown heavy. It was not anger that stirred inside you now, but clarity. You understood that healing did not mean pretending the past had never happened. Healing meant facing it fully, standing in its presence without fear. And so, when another family gathering was announced, a memorial to honor the anniversary of your mother's passing, you felt a quiet resolve rise within you. You knew this would be the moment. Not to demand what was lost, not to compete with Lydia, but to step into the room with the strength you had carried alone for so long. The day arrived. You dressed with intention, choosing clothes that felt true to who you were, rather than who they expected you to be. As you looked in the mirror before leaving, you saw not the shadow of a forgotten child, but the steady gaze of a woman who had weathered storms and endured. You whispered to your reflection, "I am enough." The drive to the family home felt both familiar and foreign. Trees you had passed 1,000 times seemed to bow with the weight of memory. Each turn of the road reminded you of summers long gone, of childhood laughter, of moments that once held innocence before favoritism carved its mark. By the time you arrived, your heart beat steady not with dread, but with resolve. Inside, the house buzzed with relatives, voices overlapping in a swirl of greetings and recollections. Lydia moved gracefully among them, her presence radiant as always, gathering smiles and compliments. You felt their eyes flicker toward you, some curious, some indifferent. Yet for the first time, you did not shrink beneath their gaze. You walked forward with calm certainty, each step carrying the quiet strength of your journey. The ceremony began. Words were spoken of your mother, her kindness, her devotion, her love for her family. You listened, your chest tightening with longing, but also with gratitude. For in those moments, you remembered the letters she had left you, the encouragement she had whispered across time. It was as though she stood beside you, unseen, reminding you of who you were. When the formalities ended, conversation returned to its familiar rhythm. Lydia spoke of her recent endeavors, her voice carrying easily across the room. The family leaned in, nodding, affirming. You stood silently at first, watching, feeling the old script unfold once again. But then something inside you shifted. You realized you no longer had to stay silent, no longer had to let your story remain hidden. When a relative turned to you and asked casually, "And how have you been?" Close quote, you did not dismiss the question with a polite answer, as you once might have. You met their eyes and spoke clearly. You spoke of your work, not with arrogance, but with honesty. You described the cases you had fought, the lives you had touched, the victories that had mattered not only in court, but in the hearts of those you defended. The room grew quiet, almost imperceptibly at first. Faces turned toward you, expressions shifting as they listened. Even Lydia's smile faltered for a moment. You had not planned to command attention, but your truth carried its own weight. You continued, speaking not only of your work, but of your life, the independence you had built, the home you had made for yourself, the resilience you had forged in the face of neglect. Every word was a stone laid carefully, not to build walls, but to construct a bridge of understanding. For you were not seeking vengeance. You were seeking voice. By the time you finished, silence lingered in the room. Some looked at you with newfound respect, others with surprise. Lydia shifted uncomfortably, as though the spotlight she had always taken for granted had been shared without her consent. Your parents sat quietly, their expressions unreadable, but their eyes fixed on you in a way you had longed for all your life. You did not gloat. You did not demand apologies. You simply stood in the truth of your existence, no longer invisible, no longer erased. The moment passed, and conversations resumed, but something had shifted. You felt it in the air, subtle but undeniable. For the first time, they had seen you not as a shadow, not as a lesser half, but as yourself. That night, when you returned home, you sat once more by your desk. You opened your notebook and wrote, "I spoke today." And they listened. Tears welled in your eyes, but they were not tears of sorrow. They were tears of release. For you had carried the weight of silence for too long, and now, at last, you had broken it. You realized then that closure was not about winning or losing, not about proving who deserved more. Closure was about finding your voice and allowing it to be heard. And you had done that. In the quiet of your room, you felt your mother's presence again, not in the heirlooms that had been given away, but in the strength she had left within you. That strength had carried you here, had allowed you to reclaim what favoritism once tried to take. You closed your eyes, breathed deeply, and felt a peace settle over you. The story was not perfect, but it was yours. And that, at last, was enough. You sat quietly in your room that evening, the echo of the gathering still alive in your memory. For years you had wondered if you would ever be seen, if your voice would ever matter in the family that had once overlooked you. And now, though no apologies were spoken, you felt a quiet recognition, a shift too subtle to name, but powerful enough to free you. You realized that dignity does not come from what others grant you, it comes from